So we just know that because of the SEC postponed the decision of, an ETF, and then Bitcoin price just fell down sharply. So we want to know what is ETF, or at least what's the implication of the proposed ETF? What does that mean?
Okay, so an ETF is an exchange-traded fund, and it is a way for people to put assets into a trust and then have those trusts trade like their stocks of a company on an exchange. And why that's important is it gives the market and the investor easy liquidity into asset classes that otherwise would be hard to invest in as an investor.
Do you have an easier way?
So for instance, if you want to buy gold, you would have to go and buy a bar of gold and you have to hold it and transport it, and it's heavy and it's hard to sell. It's much easier to buy an ETF which holds the gold for you, and then you trade the shares as if it's a share of stock, and therefore you're able to trade it by pressing a button on a screen and receiving back the value without ever touched or even understood how you would touch the gold. So an ETF for Bitcoin would enable a person to buy or sell Bitcoin at a market price on an exchange electronically, instantaneously, without ever having to understand how to buy Bitcoin or even what Bitcoin is.
So if this one is approved in September, what kind of effect it will give to the market?
Well, it'll be a positive effect for several reasons for Bitcoin. The first is that it will make the availability of access to Bitcoins go up significantly. So instead of just the people who understand crypto wallets, which is a couple million people in the world, you would have the ability of anyone who can buy or sell a share of stock in the New York Stock Exchange, the ability to buy Bitcoin. So all of a sudden your audience would become hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, and individuals could buy it with no problem. They wouldn't have to worry about security. They wouldn't have to worry about understanding how to use a wallet, and they would know that they have instantaneous liquidity to buy and sell. So liquidity drives value. And so if we had that access to liquidity, you would have significantly higher prices for Bitcoin, because more people who would like to buy it would be able to buy it and would be more secure in holding it and would know that they have a market to sell it.
So what do you think is the reason that SEC declined to approve this proposal for some times?
The SEC is still waiting to see if they approve of Bitcoin as a concept. Bitcoin is not only an economic and technological advancement. There's also some social and political implications to Bitcoin as it relates to how governments control currency and how banks control the movement of money between individuals and between countries. So I think that the governments are still figuring out what their position is, and while they're doing that, they're trying to hold back liquidity until they have a position so they can try and regulate and tax and control the market for Bitcoin over time. So they're just waiting to understand at some point they will do it, or at some point they could outlaw it completely, and what the impact of that becomes, you won't know until it happens. But the likely choice is that most governments will approve ETFs. They'll put certain rules and restrictions on who can buy and sell them, and how it gets taxed, and how it gets controlled, and how they identify who's holding it. And once they feel comfortable in those positions, I would think they most likely will release the ETFs and allow them to trade.
So you mean most of the government, that means not just in the United States. Is there any government who already approved?
This is a global phenomenon, and all governments are wondering how to address it. Certain governments, like the United States and China, have more to lose than smaller countries like Malta or Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. And so I think you'll see some of the smaller jurisdictions move faster because they have less to lose, and if they're right, they could attract capital and become more important in the future world economy. Whereas people like the United States, Japan, Korea, China, Russia need to think about their existing position as world powers and what their currency matters in terms inside their own country and internationally. And you'll start to see them develop policies, and very likely develop policies together or in competition with each other. And that's part of the interesting question as this market develops.
Do you think the SEC in the United States will have a bigger, impact over the global market?
Historically, the United States capital markets have been leaders in creating new opportunities for capital formation and for funding the next set of opportunities by technology and by industry. Right now, the United States seems to be wavering in its leadership position, and I think that this is an opportunity for other jurisdictions maybe to take some of that lead. I'm not saying all, but some of that lead. Or it's an opportunity for the United States to reassert itself as a leader technologically and economically and politically and socially, and step in here and say this is something important for the future, and here's how we're going to support, world peace, fight climate change, and help people be safe and happy throughout the world. Historically, that's been the role of the United States, and I hope that's the role the United States plays in the future.
Just curious, like how many organizations are trying to, promote this concept and, help the SEC to make a decision?
I think there's a lot of things happening in public, and there's a lot of things happening in private with relationship to people communicating with the government. In general, there's the people who currently have their position of power, who don't want things to change, or if there's going to be change, they want to control it. And there's other people who are not in control right now and who would like to have a more important position in the future, that are trying to establish themselves. I think that these are wide and some known and unknown groups, and that you won't really know until everything's done, who was effective and who wasn't. But the only sure thing is that a lot more people than you know about are focusing on this right now.
Do you have any expectation for the decision in September?
I believe that ETFs will be approved in the United States by the SEC and in other places globally. I don't think anybody knows if it's September, October, November, or even a year from now. I hope that it's sooner because I think it's important, and I think that it makes sense economically and socially. But as I said, there's a lot of competing interests here, and really when this decision happens is almost a random event. And will probably be driven by external factors as much as by internal factors.
Oh, you have anything to add?
I think that it's important to remember that blockchain and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and all these changes that are happening along the distributed ledger are much bigger than the price of Bitcoin. And that Bitcoin is just the first example of what happens when the technology works and when it gets mass adoption and critical mass. But just because this is working and people are paying attention to it doesn't mean it's important in the long term. What's important in the long term is how does distributed ledger affect the politics, society, economy, and religion of how people interact with each other and how businesses interact with people over the future. And so what we're really watching right now is the very, very early part of what happens when technology starts to have an effect on how we relate to each other as human beings.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay.